Hey, this is Jackson Berthold with the Marriott Student Review. This is Measuring Success Right. Today I have Wayne Parker here with me, the former Chief Administrative Officer of Provo. Wayne's actually got a really long history of city management experience, city administrative experience, and I think he has a really just awesome set of experiences that can help BYU students understand what is going on in their city. I mean, you were the city manager of Provo for 20
20
years, like
years. Yep.
2003 to
hmm
2023. That's insane. I mean, I guess like what was that? I don't know. Like that's the longest someone has been a city manager, or sorry, like CAO for
Right.
for Provo. What was
Yes.
that like?
It was back in 1982 when the voters of Provo selected a new form of government. They'd been in a city commission form, which was pretty dysfunctional. And so they adopted this council mayor form with the chief administrative officer as part of the requirement of the form of government. And um, and so that's now been 42 years, and I served almost half of that time
Wow, there
as
you
the
go.
CAO. So there you go. That gives you a
Yeah,
sense of a little bit of the history.
you've come to define the position.
Uh, that may be.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, yeah.
I
Thanks for
had great predecessors, though. Let me
Oh
just say
yeah,
that right up
yeah,
front.
yeah. Thanks for coming on the show with us.
Sure.
You mind if I just get us started with
No,
some of our
absolutely.
questions? So, I guess I kind of want to talk to you about the greatest challenges you faced as
Okay.
like the city like administrator. Like,
Yeah.
what specifically to Provo? Because you've been a city administrator
hmm
and manager
Right.
numerous different cities. What about Provo gives it unique challenges or unique opportunities compared to a lot of these other cities?
Well, that's a great question. So Provo is kind of unique. For a city of its size, about 120,000 population, about a third of that population are young adults from 18 to 30. And so it's a very young, vibrant, engaged community. Um, but it also creates some stresses. Students, young adults can sometimes create stress in neighborhoods. Sometimes neighborhoods create stress for students. And so it was always kind of a challenge to try to balance the needs of the younger part of our community with the older established neighborhoods and some neighborhoods that have been in transition. Southeast Provo, for example, has been kind of a quiet to sleepy part of town, but recently, as boundaries have expanded, housing boundaries and so on, it's become a real high density area for students and young adults, young professionals, and that's created some dilemmas with the neighborhood seeing change occur. And so I think one has been trying to balance the needs of kind of the older established residents with the newer
Hmm.
residents, and some of the residents who are here and then don't stay very long, are gone after 4 years or 6 years, and so that's part of it. I think one of the challenges that's not unique to Provo, but certainly one that Provo struggles with, is the idea of having enough resources to meet the demands of our residents. And we saw this for years. To hark back a number of years, the city had a recreation center that they shared with the Provo School District. It was located at Provo High. Um, Huge annual subsidies, almost $1 million a year in subsidy to that recreation center. And our residents wanted something better. They'd seen rec centers in other communities that were, really high end, and so we went through a whole process of trying to define what a good recreation center would look like for Provo, what people would pay fees to participate in, and how much they'd be willing to pay in terms of an annual property tax assessment to build the rec center. And so it was quite an interesting process for the city council to reach the decision to actually put it on the ballot. And again, that's been now a little over 10 years ago, and the voters approved it on about a 60-40 vote. And we built the recreation center, and it's now the largest self-sustaining recreation center in the country, where the user fees actually pay all the costs, and there's no general tax subsidy except for the bonds, which were
Mm.
used to build the center. So it's been a great success story. But again, it took engaging the community, engaging the elected officials, and getting buy-in in order to have a really great amenity for this community.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. Actually, that does prompt a question.
Sure.
What are some of your like favored or like some of the best strategies for getting that sort of buy-in from, community like leaders, community magnates? I know
Yeah,
that's kind of a
it's a
broad
great,
question.
it's a really good question. Citizen engagement takes all kinds of forms, right? Traditionally, you think about citizen engagement being, the public hearing where people come and they give you pros and cons about various decisions you're contemplating as an elected body. Um, but but again, particularly with the polarization that's occurred in the last 15 years or so in our political discourse, public hearings are not nearly as effective as they used to be. The first three people that stand up at a public hearing define how the hearing is going to go. Because if they all take one position, you might have others in the audience who want to take the other, but now they're intimidated, right? And they're afraid they're going to alienate their friends and neighbors, and so they sit quietly and say nothing. So we've tried to do a number of other ways. We've done open houses where people submit their comments, in writing, or maybe they go through a series of sort of booths or spots in the public hearing or in the open house where they learn about different facets of the proposal that's before the city council, and then they stop at a laptop on their way out and enter their comments and opinions. We did that with the bus rapid transit system. That was a good one where public hearings tended to be pretty rancorous, and so when we started trying to do better education along with getting feedback, we got much better feedback. So there's that. We've done focus groups. We've done neighborhood committees, like for designing parks, where we've brought neighbors together and brought a bunch of different options for a neighborhood park and let them pick, and then design the park around their desire. So again, various strategies can be used just depending on what the circumstances are.
That makes sense. I mean, it seems like there's a common theme of connection, wanting to make
Yes.
sure there's a very efficient flow of information between,
Yep.
just the administration and the citizens.
Yep, for
I was
sure.
I was just talking to the city administrator for Springville a little while
Uh-huh.
ago, and he was telling me about all of these surveys that they
Yes.
perform, and it gave me a clue into how public officials are able to just sort of like integrate with the population and
Yep.
fully understand
Yeah.
what they're doing. Or what they want or what their priorities are. It does prompt a question. How is there a way that business leaders can learn from these sort of strategies, or is there anything in general that you think business leaders could learn from your experiences from in city administration or just government in general?
I think, again, my experience working with the business community has, they generally feel kind of frustrated at the process, right? It's slow, it's not very nimble, and there's reasons for that, right? Our residents expect us to do full due diligence in the bright light of transparency. That can create some headaches for a business leader who's used to saying, this is what I'm going to do. I remember once I was sitting on a board when I worked up in the Ogden area with a large owner of a very large business in Ogden, family-owned business, and he was sitting in our meeting and he was just really frustrated. And we had taken a break and we're coming back, and he said, Wayne, I don't understand this. He said, when I put a motion before my board of directors, I just say, all in favor say aye, all opposed say I resign. It is so easy to get stuff done. And I said, yeah, that doesn't happen in the public sector. People don't get to play that kind of role. And so there are processes in place. A lot of them are put in place by elected officials who live 24/7, 365 with their stakeholders. Businesses typically don't live 24/7, 365 with their shareholders. They come in, they're represented on the board. The board comes in and makes decisions. The shareholders might occasionally have to hold an election, but it's pretty rare that they actually work and live and breathe and do service projects together with their shareholders. And so our elected officials tend to be very responsive to the desires of the electorate, and that's different than I think in the private sector. The other thing I just mentioned that's also a little different is the private sector tends to be focused, for the most part, on measurable outcomes, and they measure their performance in very discrete ways. You got certain metrics you got to hit, or there's trouble on the front. Public sector has a lot harder time trying to come up with measurable outcomes, right? So many of the outcomes we want local government has very little influence over. I remember when I was doing performance measurement for Governor Levitt for a couple of years during his administration. The state health department came in and said, we want to reduce the incidence of heart disease in rural Utah. And we said, well, that's really good until, a rural town gets their first McDonald's, right? And then what happens? How do you control the incidence of heart disease in a small community over which you have very little control? And so we had to start thinking about other kinds of measures that we could actually measure and celebrate or realize we're falling short. But again, our outcomes are very little in our control, but they're community good that we hope can happen in a community.
Oh yeah, no, that makes sense. It does make just the local government very frustrating because so much is expected of local public administrators, and so much pressure is placed on them, but they lack a lot of that power and influence, and are oftentimes, it seems like, hamstringed by governments above them
Yes.
and citizen priorities below them, and that's a very difficult thing to navigate.
It's a tricky place to be. I just had a phone call with a BYU alum who's taking his first city manager job out in South Carolina, South Carolina. And he and I had an hour and a half conversation about what do you do when you first start in a city administrator role? How do you get the elected officials to buy in? We talked about, coming up with a really good strategic plan, strategic approach, and then engaging your community in what you spend your money on. And when you get that sort of engagement, then you can move forward. But if you're constantly battling, one group who wants a new library and another group who wants stormwater improvements because their basements get flooded all the time, it's really hard to figure out how you balance those two things. But if you get the whole community engaged around the bigger issues, it's a lot easier to prioritize and actually get stuff done.
I mean, that makes sense, and I think this more delves into like politics than government administration or business, but uniting people around shared priorities that are larger than our own sort of parochial concerns. Honestly, that's a good strategy just in general.
Yeah, I've one thing I talk to managers across the region with my position with the International City County Management Association is around kind of how do you deal with elected officials who come in wanting to, clean out the deep state and all of those kinds of things, and realize that, there are no Democratic potholes, there's no Republican parks, there's no, libertarian sewer lines. The fact is that most of what we do in local government has very little to do with political bias. And it has a lot to do with trying to understand what the community wants and needs and then figuring out how to address it.
Yeah, and that can be frustrating because it makes local governments, both cities, counties, and the state, less salient in people's minds, and it leads to them being less involved because there's a lot less just media coverage, a lot less attention in general, and sometimes I think that can have a harmful impact.
Well, and you see, I mean, it's been interesting to me over the years to watch how elections run, and in presidential years, and this year is probably no exception, you get 85% voter turnout for the presidential election. Next year, when we have local governments and most mayors in the state of Utah are running for re-election, or just the seats open, right, for people to run. If you're really, really fortunate, even with vote by mail, you're getting about 35% voter turnout. And yet what mayors and city council members do really, really matter to the day-to-day lives of our residents much more than what happens at the national level. And yet, again, it's the media coverage and the very deep divide, the polarization that we've seen occurring kind of drives that higher voter turnout. And I guess, some folks in my business say, well, if it's 32% voter turnout, it means that, 68% of the voters are happy with what's going on. I don't think that's a fair assumption, but it does argue for trying to raise the visibility of some of these local elections, make sure we're making good decisions.
No, yeah, that definitely makes sense, especially because, all of our basic amenities and pretty much every single thing that happens in our day-to-day lives is governed by state governments, by, city officials who aren't really political. They're just trying to make sure that our needs are met. And we kind of do them a disservice by completely ignoring them. It's frustrating.
Yeah, I used to sometimes host like scout groups or others that came to City Hall to learn about local government, and I'd I'd kind of start by saying, well, do you know how often the city touches your life in a day? And it was blank stares, from 8 to 8 year olds or 12-year-olds, and I'd say, what was the very first thing that happened to you this morning? The first thing you remember waking up? And somebody'd say, well, my alarm clock rang, and I said, was it plugged into the wall? Because if it was, the city touched your life that moment because you had power to run. And then then what do? Oh, I go to the bathroom. And I said, well, did you think 1 second when you flushed the toilet, what happened to what was in the toilet when it left your house? No, because the city takes care of that. Touch your life again. And you hit a sidewalk and you pressed a button to cross the street. And all these times during the day, and you went to the park and played on the swings or did soccer practice, and there we again. So it could be 100 times a day that the city actually touches your life. And how often do you feel like state government touches your life, or the federal government touches your life? We're there every minute of every day.
Yeah, no, it is kind of funny how when I talk about my ambitions to say become a city manager, it's very funny. People are surprised, like that's very specific, or I've never heard of that before in my life. It's so interesting that just the inner workings of the things that are closest to us are kind of completely.
Yeah.
Most people are just not interested.
Yeah.
And
and they live busy lives, right?
it's true. It's true. And that is an important factor to remember as well. Like there's only so many things that we can apply attention
Right.
to. But I mean, I, when it comes to like the lack of attention on cities, I think a lot of the time people that are in the business sphere, and I guess this doesn't really necessarily just apply to cities, but government in general, a lot of the time there's tension between business and government. This is like
Sure.
well established kind of perspective among lots of people in business. And I'm wondering what would you like to tell business leaders, prospective CEOs, a lot of the people over at the Marriott School, what are some tips you have for them for interacting with governments or understanding government's priorities? Because a lot of the time there's not communication between the two.
Yeah, I think so. And I think local governments are doing a better job now than they did in the early days of my career at trying to interact effectively with the business community. But there are some constraints. Again, local government lives in a fishbowl, right? Everybody can see you all the way around, all day long, every day if they want to. And again, businesses are used to kind of working behind the scenes, and sometimes that's difficult. The system is not structured to be particularly helpful with that. On the flip side, though, sometimes regulations existed at a time when there was a reason for the regulation, and that time is now past and the regulation's still there. And so when things are difficult, business leaders should reach out to the local government officials, the manager, administrator, mayor, city council member, and say, gosh, this thing isn't working for me now. Can we talk about this? And I think coming in with an approach that encourages collaboration and, I want to help you understand my perspective as a business owner, but I'm also willing to listen to your perspective as a representative of local government. And I think when we can sit down and collaborate like that, or, in the current vernacular, disagree better, and have those kinds of discussions, then I think we can help solve some of the problems that businesses feel local government's created for them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. In a lot of my conversations I've had with people in local government, it seems like there's a theme of transparency, more openness, more communication, more trust. And I think that's just a broader trend, or not trend, but a broader principle that we can apply as regards just government or politics, of just learning to trust those whom we don't understand or that we don't necessarily have established relationships with yet.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good thing. I'm going to pivot a little bit here to talk about something that I don't know, a lot of people I don't think are aware of the principles that sort of govern public administrators' lives, or their careers, or their sort of leadership philosophies. And in being in the MPA program, I've learned a great deal about these priorities that I was just unaware of. What is your leadership philosophy? As public administrator, or you're now the regional director for ICMA, what was the Mountain Plains
Mountain
region.
Plains. Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you apply your leadership philosophy there and during your time with as the CAO of Provo?
Well, people get into local government for a whole wide variety of reasons. Very seldom is it for prestige or money, right? Those things don't typically go. And so I think as I've watched this over the years in my own career and the career of others, you sort of have to start from the position of what I'd call a servant heart. You need to be there for the right reasons, right? You want to make your community better. You believe in democracy and you believe in representative government and you believe government should meet the objectives of the community which it serves. And so I've tried to take that and kind of apply it to my leadership. And again, it's really popular right now to talk about servant leadership, but lots of us have been doing that for a long time. And just kind of saying, look, I'm here to serve. I'm here to make life better. And so how do we do that? And how do we help our employees? 800 city employees in Provo. How do you transmit that value to them? And we've I think found some good ways to do that. But so I've tried to look at it as how can I help you as an employee better achieve your objectives and goals? How can I help you as a resident? How can I help you as an elected official? Communicate with me what your expectations are, and let me do the best I can to meet them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Were there any instances where you had to use your leadership philosophy or your values to overcome like a difficult challenge? Like when it comes to like managing personnel or trying to overcome like differences in personality or philosophy or
Okay.
your interactions with public or elected officials?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. I think I think back on the pandemic, which was, again, we were absolutely managing by the seat of our pants. We had very little clue what was going on at the time. And the more and more data we got, the easier it got to manage. But we immediately sent a whole bunch of our employees home to work from home. And we spent a lot of money on laptops and things so employees could work from home. And for the large part, our customer service operation went almost entirely virtual. But we were losing touch with our employees because we didn't see them, they didn't see us. And so one of the things I spent time on during the pandemic was I did a daily newsletter we actually did a blog for all of our employees that was just it was just me talking to them personally. And so it went from, current statistics on the pandemic to vaccines to all of the pandemic stuff. But we also did we shared the mayor's calendar so people would know what the mayor was up to during that time. I shared my taste in music, which is pretty eclectic, and I got lots of fun comments about that. When I started doing virtual meetings, we put up a survey on our blog and asked employees to pick from like 6 virtual backgrounds that I could use on my Zoom meetings, and I guarantee that I would use it for at least a month during that time. And they picked this really off the wall version of the Batcave, and so for a month I was broadcasting from the Batcave on my meetings. But again, it was an effort to try to say, look, we want to stay in touch. We want you to feel like you're part of the organization. Want to boost morale. And by the time the pandemic was over, I'd done 500 of those daily updates, and so there's those kinds of things where you sort of take that servant leadership attitude. I think I always, from a disciplinary perspective, it was always my goal that an employee would never be surprised if I told them we were kind of done with their service and they needed to move on, that they had plenty of opportunity to correct deficiencies, that we were out, upfront about, and it's the way I wish I'd been treated, right? So again, we just get this, I'm here to serve you, to make your career better, but we clearly also have expectations of you and want you to deliver on those.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's actually, I think, a very valuable perspective. I haven't actually heard as much about this like service-oriented leadership. And I really appreciate that like perspective, and I think a lot of people could benefit from it because it seems like there's a general belief or consensus in towards many institutions, both government and private, that things are cutthroat. That
Yeah.
you can't trust, a corporation, you can't trust a government. I mean, it goes back to what I was
Yeah.
saying before.
Sure.
There's a huge lack of trust, and when leaders are able to come to the table with those below them, those that are reliant on them, and are able to like develop a relationship of trust and like mutual benefit, that can be, I think, really powerful for restoring faith in a lot of our institutions. Because I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know if you've oh, I think it's not Nesbitt or something. It's Bowling Alone. You know
Oh
that book.
yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yep.
that I think
Robert
is
Putnam.
yes, Putnam. There must be something else relating to
Yeah.
social capital with
Yeah.
a person
But
with that
that's a
last
really good
name.
one.
But yeah, honestly, I think that book is evocative of like the current state of our
Yes.
public and private institutions, and values like that and leadership like that I think is necessary
Yeah.
for us to just improve the current like social trajectory we're on.
Well, one of my best friends and closest colleagues over the years is a guy named Bill Halterstrom, who runs the United Way of Utah County.
Oh yeah.
And Bill and I have had lunch together every month for almost 20 years. And one of the things that he said, which comes back to the Putnam issue, is that people are happiest and most fulfilled in a neighborhood where they actually know their neighbors. And so many people I talk to around the country, if I ask them the question, well, tell me about your next door neighbor, they don't have a clue, don't even know their name, right? Maybe the kids know each other, but the parents probably don't. And so when we were struggling about 15 years ago with a neighborhood in South Provo that was pretty high crime for our community, lots of dysfunction. Our Mayor Billings used to say that folks in this neighborhood would call the police when they couldn't agree on who would change the channel on the remote. It was just people just weren't functional. And so we put a little task force together to try to figure out how could we get people to know each other better. And it resulted in us building what's now called the South Franklin Community Center and programming that with lots of things. We did like Zumba classes during the day for moms whose kids were at school. We did computer classes. We did tutoring, homework help. We had a soccer club. And all of a sudden, we started seeing as people started knowing each other, and then they'd hang out with each other. And then the moms who did Zumba would get together and have a picnic after school or during the summer. And pretty soon, graffiti went way down, calls for service went way down, and this neighborhood started really becoming a whole lot more functional. And other things have happened since then, which I think have accelerated it even. But again, this idea that angry teenagers don't tag the homes of people that their parents have brought cookies to. That just doesn't happen, right? And the more you can invest in that social capital, really dramatically improves the quality of life in a community, way more than what city services by themselves can do.
Oh yeah, it's funny. The second you said social capital, that was the word that came to my mind. It feels like we're having a crisis of social
Yeah,
capital.
we for sure are.
I mean, Utah and New England are doing, fairly all right
Yeah.
relative to the rest of the country, but I think it's something that public administrators and honestly community leaders in general, people who aren't even in the public sector, should probably take a look at in order to try to improve our current or just the straits that we're in right
Well,
now.
and a lot of the things that used to protect social capital, things like service clubs and churches and PTAs, and are all struggling now with people attending church. Service clubs are that used to have 80 members now have 20 members, and PTAs just kind of come and go. But when parents are done with kids in school, they're out of PTA, and so again, I think we have to figure out ways, and those could be all the way from things like community centers to encouraging block parties to coming up with ways that we can help residents find another way to engage socially and meet their neighbors and develop friendships and relationships that just aren't there anymore.
Yeah, I mean that. Yeah, honestly, that's I think so necessary, and I think it's something that business leaders could also get involved with.
Yes, for
There are
sure.
people with lots of connections, lots of available capital. They could potentially act as a major catalyst for that kind
Yep,
of change.
for
I
sure.
I think that would be perfect, especially if governments and local leaders or business leaders were coordinating on that sort of thing.
Well,
That would be super
yeah,
valuable.
and the collaboration between sectors just is becoming ever more important. No single group, particularly between local government and the social sector, no single group has enough resources to do everything that's demanded. But when you put the resources together and prioritize, now you got something.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely that's something on the docket on the just list of priorities that I think should be more salient
Yep,
to
I'm with
politicians
you.
and just I don't just public commentators. I feel like more people should be talking about it,
Yep.
but it's an issue that I don't think gets enough attention. So I think to finish us off, I have some values that we're
Hmm.
interested in talking
Sure.
to you about. Um, so these are the values of the Marriott School: faith in Christ, integrity in action, respect for all, and excellence. And I was wondering, you could talk about any of them or
Okay.
all of them.
Okay.
I was just wondering which ones you saw apply in your career and in your life, whether it's just service or your relationships with family, anything like
Good.
that.
Yeah, good. Well, yeah, let me just talk about those. I love those. I think they reflect not only the Marriott School today, but the Marriott School as it was 40 plus years ago when I got my degree here. Um, so faith in Christ for sure. I mean, we talked about servant leadership. There's probably no better example, right, of servant leadership. I mean, it's the epitome of how Christ operated in mortality. And so asking the question, what would Jesus do? Man, if we're not asking that all the time as local government leaders, we're missing an opportunity to really think deeply about servant leadership. In terms of integrity, you're aware, Jackson, that ICMA has a very strong, ambitious, rigorous code of ethics that all 14,000 members of ICMA have to sign on the line and say, I believe in this and will act that way. And it really makes integrity easy when you got a code that you abide by, and you don't just put it up on your wall, but you're living it. And some of those things are hard. Some of those standards are pretty high, but again, no higher than just personal integrity would be. Um, from the standpoint of respect for all, um, I think it's really easy in local government, again, because resources tend to be kind of strapped and you're always wanting to do more than you have the capability to do. It's really easy to think, well, what are my neighbors going to think? What are my stakeholders, the ones that I interact with, so the school superintendent or the United Way director or whoever that's kind of in your circle, um, or the folks that are, just your neighbors, the people who call you regularly. It's really easy to sort of think about what they think and want. But you recognize that there's a whole set of every community that feels disenfranchised, no matter how hard you push them to get involved, how hard you try to get them into a focus group or to come to an open house or something. They don't feel a part. And we have to remember those folks always. And so when we have discussions about, right now in Utah, one of the key issues is housing affordability, which is a really big issue, really thorny, complex, lots of pieces to the puzzle. But if we just look around our neighborhood and say, well, my neighbors are all fine, then we're asking the wrong question, right? We should be asking, what are their grandchildren experiencing? And what are the folks who are coming, the young professionals who are moving in to careers, how are we going to meet their housing needs? And how do we help them get to a point with employment and otherwise that they can afford a home? Um, and then finally, kind of remind me of the last one.
Oh, yeah, I always
I'm
forget. Is
sorry,
this
got going and I
excellence that we were talking about?
excellence,
Excellence,
yeah,
yeah.
right. And again, that's also, it's easy to be complacent in government because things are, in many ways, things are the way they were 40 years ago. Technology is certainly better, communications certainly better, but the underlying values and principles really haven't changed all that much. But raising the bar for employees, for local government leaders, for
Mhm.
elected officials, that's really important. I think our electorate demands that. They want us to target being the very best we can be, and I think cities who are willing to jump on that bandwagon really can make a difference in their communities.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Actually, on that subject of excellence, I wonder what you have to say to potential future leaders that are currently studying at the Marriott School. What sort of lessons you have for them, or what you think that future leaders should keep in mind, just given your experiences as like a recent public administrator.
I think, well, there's a couple of things. I think, and it was interesting for me to walk through the library. It's been a while since I've been in the Lee Library today, and see all the collaboration space, and thinking, that really is the answer to most of our problems. If we try to operate in our silos, we will always come up short. And whether that's in business, or it's in the social sector, or in the public sector, or in our families, collaboration is, communication and collaboration are the way we get stuff done. And when we miss that opportunity, then we've missed big. The only other one I maybe just conclude on is I'll just share a story from early in my career that changed my view of local government management forever back then. So my first internship out of college was at the city of Kansas City, Missouri. And I worked with a legendary city manager named Bob Kipp. And Bob was extraordinarily good mentor for me. And in a city of 500,000 people with 5,000 city employees, he took time to spend time with me as an intern in the manager's office. And one day he came over to my desk and said, "Wayne, let's go for a ride." I said, "Okay, I'll one-on-one time with the boss." That doesn't happen very often. So we took a ride and we went out to what's called the bus barn, which is where the Kansas City transit system maintained all their buses. And we went out there. The local, or the transit department was there. They had their slideshow presentation. Back then it wasn't a PowerPoint, it was an overhead projector.
Oh, yeah.
And talked about all the stats and stuff. And so we got done, and Bob said, "Boy, that was really interesting. Thanks so much." And he said, "I'd really like to go out into the maintenance facility and talk to some of our employees." And they said, "Sure, great, go ahead." And so we went out, and he kind of nudged me to come with him. And he went, they had a bus up on the hydraulic rack, and there was a mechanic working on the bus. And Bob went over, and he was kind of in his suit and tie, and he looked up and he said, "What are you doing?" And the guy said, "I am fixing the brakes on this bus." And he looked up and he looked at the brakes and the wheels, and he came back and he said, "That's not what you're doing." And he said, "No, really, I am. I'm fixing the brakes on this bus." And Bob looked up and around again. He said, "No, you're really not doing that." And he said, "Okay, Mr. Big Shot in the tie and suit, what am I doing?" He said, "You, my friend, are making sure that my neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, can get from her house to her job downtown and back home in the evening to cook dinner for her kids and get them to bed so they can go to school the next morning and start the day all over again. That's what you're doing under the bus." And I get emotional even thinking about that experience today. And I used to share that with all of our city employees when they'd come to their employee orientation. And I said, "You are, and I am, the Chief Quality of Life Officer for the city of Provo. That's what you do. And whether you're picking up, garbage out of garbage cans, or whether you're a lifeguard at the pool, or whether you're, working the water treatment plant, or wherever it is you work, or a police officer or a firefighter, your job is to ensure that quality of life is better tomorrow than it was today, and better today than it was yesterday." And I think that that attitude, that bias, for leaders is, I think if we all looked at it that way, that everything we do for our employees should make life better for them. Everything we do for our stakeholders and shareholders should make life better for them. Everything we do for our customers should make life better for them. And if that's what we're doing, then we're going to be successful leaders.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That was
Okay.
actually a fantastic story and a great way to end the podcast. So I'd just like to thank Wayne for joining us today. It's been an honor to have you here.
Well, thank you, Jackson. Good to be here.
Yeah, and I guess we'll see you around.
Okay. Thanks very much.
And to our listeners, our viewers, thank you for joining us as well. That was Measuring Success Right.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect official policy or position of Brigham Young University or The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.